Let me repeat myself. I grew up in a Conservative family during Section 28. I still turned out trans. I had zero influence in school. I didn't even know that there was such a thing. And yet now that I'm a learned person, I speak to people around the world, I know that there is no such thing as gender ideology.
Now, here's a question that's been exercising many of you this morning. What should schools do when a pupil says they want to adopt a different gender? It's happening more and more often. A new report says that many schools are ignoring safeguarding principles by not telling parents what's going on. Lottie Moore is a research fellow at Policy Exchange, which has tried to uncover schools' policies using freedom of information requests.
Parents are not being routinely informed when a child expresses gender distress at school. Schools are not informing their designated safeguarding lead, which, when a child expresses any kind of mental health concern, that they should be doing. So medical practitioners or safeguarding leads have not been involved in these conversations. 4 in 10 secondary schools are operating policies of self-ID at school.
Now, Miriam Cates is the Conservative MP for Penistone and Stockbridge and also sits on the Education Select Committee. Good morning to you.
Morning.
I suppose the headline is very interesting here, but it's difficult to really get a grip on actually how common this is, because it's not every school in England, and not every school obviously would have responded. And then there's lots of different stats, aren't there, in this? 7 in 10 schools failing to inform families when pupils question or change identity, report finds. So that includes pupils who are just questioning rather than actually changing. How big of an issue do you think this actually is?
Well, actually, I think the report is very clear about the evidence for how widespread it is. And actually, it's a landmark report because of that, because they've used freedom of information requests and very sound methodology for the research. And we already know that around 80% of secondary schools do have children who express some sort of trans identity. So this evidence on top of that actually shows that only 28% of schools are reliably informing parents when a child discloses feelings of gender distress. I mean, that does demonstrate that it's extremely widespread, that safeguarding procedures are being ignored. And I think if we just take a step back from this and think about other mental health concerns, if a child said to a teacher that they thought they were fat and were trying to starve themselves, or if they expressed anxiety or depression or something like that, the idea that a teacher would then say, well done, that's great that you feel like that, I'll help you, I'll affirm you in that feeling, and let's keep it a secret from your parents. I mean, that's quite distressing and clearly a failure of safeguarding procedures, and that would be very much discouraged against in any school setting.
Right.
But that is what's happening with gender distress, which is a mental health concern.
Okay, well, we spoke to Rachel Reeves from Labour, and she made a point that, of course, she would want to know, but she says that in some instances, relationships have broken down between parents and children over this issue. I mean, you can imagine, that the conversations that might be going on at home or whatever, and then a child takes that into school, finds a more welcoming, affirmative atmosphere there, decides, for, I don't know for how long, for a month, a year, for the rest of their lives, who knows, that they want to change their gender. And at that point, the school feel that we don't want to aggravate the situation. And perhaps the child also says, I don't want my parents to know about this right now because I'm just trying to find my place. I mean, would that be an understandable situation?
It would be a clear breach of safeguarding principles, which is that you always inform parent. The number one way to keep a child safe is to maintain a good relationship with their parents, for parents to take the responsibility for that child. The only exception to that is when there are reasons not to inform a parent, for example, in recognised cases of abuse, or when the parent is the risk. But if that's the case, there would be social services involved, and the school would know that there's a clear reason not to inform parents. For the vast majority of cases, the right thing to do from a safeguarding point of view is to inform parents. And let's just think about what's going on here. Parents want the best for their children. We know that this is not just a case of schools affirming children in their perceived gender identity. The report also shows that nearly 3/4 of schools are actually teaching that people have a gender identity that may be different from their biological sex. Now, that's an unevidenced, extreme position that probably the vast majority of parents understandably don't share. And so if a parent disagrees that their girl, let's say, is actually now a boy and should be treated as a boy, then personally, I think the parent who has responsibility for that child and cares about the child's best interest should be listened to. And it's not up to the school to push an unevidenced ideology on a child in conflict with their parents' interests. Again, if you thought about a different ideology or unevidenced belief system, I think we would see how wrong that is. And somehow this gender ideology, which again, as I said, is extreme and unevidenced, has been given this special status whereby what a child says goes, whereas in all other cases that would not be the case.
Okay, Miriam, just finally, because we want to speak to someone else on this. Rachel Reeves said that there needs to be more up-to-date guidance on this specific problem in schools. What do you think should happen?
So I absolutely agree. And I think one of the most concerning aspects of the report is the possibly unlawful policies that some schools are employing around mixed sex toilets, changing rooms, and even sports. Now, very clearly, that is a safeguarding risk in itself. It's unfair for girls to compete against sports and all other things, and it's probably unlawful. So at the very least, we desperately need guidance that confirms the need for single-sex spaces. But we also need guidance around what is and isn't a medical intervention, because I think Dr. Hilary Cass has made clear that affirming a child in their gender distress is a medical intervention. Schools are not qualified to do it, and the Department for Education needs to make that clear.
Okay, Miriam Cates, thank you. She's a Conservative MP and sits on the Education Select Committee.
Let's also speak to someone who knows safeguarding and schools well. Marie Rackley is a former teacher and currently works in the education sector. They're trans. They're joining us this morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning. I'm just speechless from what I've just heard. You best ask me a question, because I don't know what to say.
Well, I guess there's a straightforward argument there, I suppose, was safeguarding is always a matter between teachers, pupils and parents, and therefore parents should always be involved in issues to do with a student's mental health, including their gender identity.
Well, this is why you don't have people have no idea what they're talking about informing policy. I'm not here to comment about the political affiliation of the people who commissioned this. People can look up the voting records of the politicians involved. It's a very, very biased report, and some of the language that's used in it is unbelievable, really. With regards to safeguarding, they're not really aware of what the safeguarding process is. The safeguarding process is that you listen to the child. Now, I'm not just talking about trans issues or gender identity. I'm talking about everything. You listen to the child. And it quite categorically states that your legal duty as a teacher, as a designated safeguarding leader, whatever it is that you forego judgment. You do not make a judgment, and you must put all your prejudices aside. And the other thing as well, with regards to what you say about informing parents, is that there is no legal obligation to inform parents. There is no legal obligation to inform parents. The only thing that Miriam Cates really got correct was that if there is a serious issue where the child can become under harm, and if it's not the parents, then yes, you cannot promise confidentiality to that child, and you must pass that on. But that may not necessarily be the parents. Now, if the child turns around and says to you, I want you to keep this between you and me, or it's only me and a group of friends who know this, or I'm very worried about my parents finding out, you have to listen to that child, but regardless of what the issue is.
Is listening to the child the same as affirming their decision? Because some people would say they're 13 years old, they're not actually capable of making large-scale decisions about their identity. And if a teacher just turns around and says, whatever else they might be going through, let's follow what you think, is a child capable of making that size decision with the teacher simply just saying, yes, I'm sure you're right? I suppose that's what some people would argue.
No, let me stop you there. You just exactly demonstrate the misconception that people have with safeguarding. Yes, I'm sure you're right. That is a judgment. You do not make a judgment. And the other thing as well, I've worked with...
But this is about affirmative...
Can I finish my point, please? Can I finish my point, please? You've given someone with a privileged position a lot of time to speak. Now it's time to listen to someone from the trans community. What's happening here is that I've worked with children younger than 11, but I've worked with 11 to 18-year-olds for over 20 years. They are pretty intelligent. And that's the other thing, which is which is really infuriating about this. I know there are teachers listening to this thinking that you are treating these 13-year-olds like they are 3 or 4 years of age. A lot of these kids know what they're talking about. And me, with my personal gender identity, I knew since I was 5 years old. The difference between me and the children today is that I grew up during Section 28, and I grew up in a Conservative family as well. And I turned out like this. And yet I didn't have all of this influence from my teachers. Look, even if it's a so-called phase, so what? If the teacher turns around and says, if you want me to call you by this pronoun or by this name, but you don't want me to call your parents, who exactly does it harm anyway? What it does actually is that it creates a safe learning environment for that student. It creates a safe learning environment for the friends of that student who are in the know. And then those students are more likely to be motivated and less likely to be disaffecting classroom. And the other thing about Miriam Cates said, these disgusting words she used, unevidenced and extreme. And you don't use the words like ideology in a policy. That just goes to show the bias of it. And teachers out there, they're trained critical thinkers, they're trained safeguarding as well. I'm really, really hopeful that they can see through this policy. And if they look at it through the critical thinking lens, which they should be teaching to their students as well, they'll see this as a very, very heavily biased report, using, they say social transition is a medical intervention. And yet Miriam Cates just came on and says, we need more clarity about what is a medical intervention. So she's contradicting herself there as well.
But is there ideology at stake? It's a very interesting point there that you're making about the question of is this just being fair to someone, or is there ideology? I mean, the report quotes some the proud trusts who provide guidance to some schools, and some schools choose to say it, and they produce resources asking children aged 7 to 11 whether they are planet boy, planet girl, planet non-binary. Now, at one level, you could say that's just asking a question. Some people might say that is positing an ideology in itself.
Let me repeat myself. I grew up in a Conservative family during Section 28. I still turned out trans. I had zero influence in school. I didn't even know that there was such a thing. And yet now that I'm a learned person, I speak to people around the world, I know that there is no such thing as gender ideology. People of multiple identities which fall outside the Western construct of gender identity have existed since human history, and they will continue to exist long after this debate is done. The only thing that really kind of gives me hope is that folks like this and all this really, really dangerous, and I think the report itself is a safeguarding issue, is that they will lose eventually. It's the thing that I fear the most is how much damage, destruction, and harm they're going to cause along the way.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you.
That's Marie Rackley, their former teacher, currently works in the education sector, saying there's no such thing as gender ideology. It's just a reality, and therefore teachers are responding to a reality. It's an interesting question, that is even saying that an ideological position itself. It feels like to me it must be. That's what ideology means. It's a set of ideas that you believe how the world is structured. And what Marie Rackley would say is this falls kind of outside of that, because it's just a sort of universal truth that people have to recognise rather than something that can be shaped.
I mean, it's interesting to hear from both perspectives, but I think what's frustrating about all of this is that you listen to that and you don't feel that you've moved on in your understanding of it, because people are so entrenched on either side, and they can't even agree on something like that, whether something is an ideology, whether it's a reality. They can't agree on the legal situation in schools, what a child's, what a teacher's legal role is. There's just one person says A and the other person says B, and how
can you be a
that's
teacher?
Disappointing, isn't it? Because when you do these interviews, you always expect to learn something or to move on in some way, and it was really difficult.
And how can you be a teacher in this? Like, what are you supposed to do if you're a teacher? You want to look after kids, you want to be reasonable, you don't want to be constrictive where you shouldn't be, but you don't want to be too laissez-faire. I mean, we've had a couple of teachers get into it. If you are a teacher in this world, if you feel confident and able to, we just heard that you've got critical thinking ability and you can just make your way through it.